Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Helen Bond. And today's topic will be based upon her book titled Pontius Pilate in History and Interpretation. The link to purchase the book will be in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below. And with that being said, welcome back to History Valley Podcast, Helen Bond.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining me. Can you tell us what we currently know about the historical Pontius Pilate?
Well, that's difficult. We actually, on one level, we know a huge amount about him for, considering he's this sort of fairly nondescript provincial governor. Because he happens to feature in the works of Josephus, both the War and the Antiquities, and Philo of Alexandria mentions him as well, and of course in the Gospels because of the trial of Jesus. So we actually have quite a few references to him in these texts. The problem is that they're all rhetorically driven, they're all aiming to persuade us of certain things, and they're not directly telling us about the historical Pilate. They're not interested in sort of, giving us a sketch of Pilate. They're telling us about other things. They're persuading the emperor not to put a statue of himself up in Jerusalem in the case of Philo's description. So we do know these things about him. We know he was governor of Judea for about 10 years. We know certain incidents in his time there. We know he seems to have been, wanting to be master in his own province, which is probably what most of these governors wanted to do. But we can't really get sort of any inside knowledge about him. Philo does give us this character description, though it's more of an assassination. And he also gives the same kind of description of anybody who he thinks is against the Jewish law. So we have all this information, but we have to be a bit careful about it. And we've also got actually a growing body of archaeological evidence too. So we have coins, there's remains of an aqueduct, remains of a sort of monumental pathway in Jerusalem. So a few sort of hard and fast bits and pieces like that, including an inscription that actually has his name in it. That gives his official title as prefect of Judea. So kind of on one level, we've got a lot of stuff, but navigating through it all is quite difficult.
What does Philo of Alexandria tell us about Pontius Pilate?
Well, it comes in Philo's book called Embassy to Gaius. And so what's happened, the sort of backstory is that the Emperor Gaius Caligula is wanting to set up a statue of himself as Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. So the year is about AD 40. Jews, of course, don't like this idea one bit. And so Philo is part of a delegation that goes to Rome to try and persuade the emperor not to do this. Now, in the course of this relatively short work, which is really, really interesting, lots of historical details, and describes the Emperor Caligula and a meeting with him too. In the course of this work, he has a letter supposedly written by the Jewish king Agrippa I, again to Caligula, to persuade him not to put up this statue. And in the course of the letter, which was probably written by Philo rather than Agrippa, but we don't know for sure. Anyway, in this letter, he talks about an incident where Pilate brings in supposedly these golden shields, and he puts them up in the Praetorium in Jerusalem. And Philo says, or Agrippa says, there's nothing that's offensive about them at all, except that they had this name on them, which people found offensive. The name is probably going to be the name of the emperor, which of course was Tiberius, son of the deified Augustus. And it's probably this that people took offense at. And in this letter, Agrippa or Philo says that the Jews finally, they asked Pilate to move them. Pilate wouldn't do that. So the Jewish leaders went to Tiberius and asked him if he would have them removed. And apparently Tiberius was incandescent with rage. He's really annoyed at Pilate and says, these things have to be moved away from Jerusalem and put them in the temple of Augustus, which again suggests that the problem was this reference to the deified Augustus. So that's the upshot of it all, is that the shields have to be moved, and Tiberius is really cross with Pilate. Now, the whole point of telling this story is to show Caligula, Gaius Caligula, who's the recipient of the letter, that a good emperor like Tiberius upholds Jewish sensitivities and, doesn't deliberately try to provoke the people in his realm. So the idea is that Tiberius gets very annoyed by this tiny, tiny infringement of Pilate. And now here Gaius is wanting to put up his statue in Jerusalem. So how much more should Gaius get the point that this is not the mark of a good emperor? So stop doing it, Gaius. That's what he's saying. So again, we have to kind of see behind this heavy rhetoric to what has Pilate actually done. He's put up some shields in Jerusalem, honorific shields that have the name of the emperor on them. Now, that's not a major offense. You can see how people might have got a little bit tetchy over that because of the reference to the deified Augustus, but presumably people are going to get worried by everything that has the emperor's official name on it. So it's not a major infringement of the Jewish law by any means. And in the course of this is where Philo also gives this character assassination of Pilate. He says that he's a mean and spiteful person, he's greedy, and he says his term of office was just one thing after another. Untried prisoners were being sent to jail. So this all sounds like, really good historical stuff, until you realize that Philo uses the same language about everybody who sets themselves up against the Jewish law. So you have to ask yourself, is this a personalized attack on Pilate, or is this just what Philo does? Philo is heavily dramatic. You're either everything that's wonderful or everything that's terrible. And Pilate, of course, here is everything that's terrible because of the rhetoric of the passage. So I think you have to treat it with quite a lot of skepticism. I mean, there's clearly something there. Pilate put up some shields. There was some problem about it. An embassy went to Tiberius and they were taken down. So, he obviously wasn't always as sensitive as he could be. People sometimes got one over on him. But, it doesn't tell us all that much about Pilate, really.
Now, what does Josephus tell us about Pilate?
Well, he tells us quite a bit more, and he tells us slightly different things. In his Jewish War, which was written about 75 or so, he has two stories about Pilate. In one, he brings in standards. So a cohort of troops are taken into the Antonia fortress, and they have standards, the big things that Roman soldiers hold, and they have certain sort of designs on them, one of which is an image of the emperor. So and apparently Josephus says that Pilate did this by night, because obviously he realized that there could be some problems here with having Roman troops that had designs of the emperor on their shields. So Josephus says that when it was morning and people saw what had happened and these offending items in the Antonia fortress, which is right next door to the temple, so in the holiest bit of Jerusalem, people took offense at this, and Pilate at the time was still in his headquarters in Caesarea on Sea, right sort of, over on the western coast. And so according to Josephus, all these people left their fields, left their work, and they all went round and they stood around his house in Caesarea for 5 days saying, we want these things removed. Finally, Pilate got pretty tired of this, and so he sent in the troops. And according to Josephus, they all raised their swords, and the people bared their necks and said they would rather be struck down than see their ancestral traditions trampled upon. At which, amazingly, Pilate was quite shocked and said, "Okay, then." He didn't want a bloodbath, and he decided that he would allow the people to have their own way this time, and so he removed the troops from Jerusalem. So that's quite a major step down for a governor, but also I think shows that although he could be insensitive, and this was probably early on in his career in Judea, so he probably wanted to start off with a fairly sort of tough outlook, but still, he could listen to public opinion, and he's not somebody who wants to just have a complete and utter bloodbath here. So, and the second story that Josephus tells us in the war is one in which Pilate builds an aqueduct for Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is on a hill. It's notoriously bad for water supply. According to Josephus, he uses some money from the temple treasury, but presumably it's with the acquiescence of the high priests, because otherwise Josephus would have told the story very differently if Pilate had just gone and swiped the money. So clearly he's working hand in hand with the Jewish aristocracy, the priests who have access to the temple money. But at some point, something goes wrong. So in the Jewish war, it seems to be that maybe Pilate used too much money. In the Antiquities, where Josephus tells the same story, he seems to suggest that it was something to do with the route of the aqueduct, or something to do with the way the building works, something like that. Anyway, there's trouble over the aqueduct. And the next time Pilate is in Jerusalem, all the people sort of stand around his tribunal, and they're all really angry and shouting. And Pilate has foreseen that there's going to be bother, and he's had all these troops dress up in plain clothes. And at a signal from him, they all get out their clubs and start battering people. And a terrible loss of life ensues. People just flee, they're running around, there's a stampede, and people die. So that's again a terrible story. I think one of the things that that Josephus is doing in the war is to kind of show two different responses. So when Jews protest quietly and dignifiedly, then they actually get what they want. When they resort to arms, then there's a bloodbath. And in the wider story, of course, this is all happening just after the Jewish War. It's called the Jewish War. And I think part of the bigger picture that Josephus is pushing here is that, Jews need to be quiet and trust to God that things will happen and things will change, and they will do. But as soon as you take up arms, as they had done in the Jewish War, things are going to go wrong. So in the Jewish Antiquities, Josephus' second book, which was written about 20 years after that, he retells with slight changes the story of the standards and the story of the aqueduct. That's the text that had at some point probably a little paragraph in there about Jesus of Nazareth, which has now been probably changed by Christian copyists. And then he has another story about the end of Pilate's term of office. Apparently a Samaritan Messiah figure sort of arose and went up Mount Gerizim with followers, all who had arms. And so when Pilate heard about this, he sent off the cavalry, and a lot of people were killed. The ringleaders were rounded up and then executed. Probably the kind of thing that a provincial governor would normally do, particularly if there is some kind of messianic claimant, and particularly if he's got a crowd of people, of followers, who have weapons with them. So it's perhaps not surprising that the Pilate gets rid of them, though it does sound as if he was quite heavy-handed with them. And the sort of the sequel to that is that the Samaritan people go to the legate of Syria, who's the most powerful man in the East and kind of Pilate's boss, and they complain to him about Pilate. And so the legate of Syria decides that he'll just send Pilate back to Rome to answer charges. Pilate had been in the province about 10 years by that time, so we don't know whether the legate of Syria thought there was anything serious in the charges or not, but presumably he thought there was enough there to send him back to Rome. And the last we hear of Pilate is he's making his way quickly to Rome to stand charge, and on the way he hears that Tiberius has died and Gaius Caligula is now on the throne. So you kind of get the sense from Josephus that things are not going to go too well for Pilate, but we don't actually hear from the antiquities what does happen.
Do Philo and Josephus both share a negative view of Pontius Pilate?
Yeah, I would say both are negative. I mean, Philo is very, very negative. I mean, that character description is about as bad as you can get. You know, it would not be a good reference if someone wrote that about you. Josephus is more nuanced, but and he's more negative, I think, in the Antiquities of the Jews. I think there he wants to show that Pilate is an insensitive person who doesn't care about the Jewish law, and in the end gets his just deserts. He gets sent off to answer charges in Rome, and it's probably not going to go well. And that again is sort of part of the theme of the Antiquities. People who follow the Jewish law do well, people who don't tend to suffer in some way or another. So so the difficulty is that they're not interested in Pilate as a character. They're just using him to sort of further the broader aims of their works. But yeah, I think it was pretty safe to say that neither of them have a high opinion of Pilate.
Do the way that Philo and Josephus view Pilate differ from the Gospel's point of view?
Sorry, I didn't catch that question.
Do both Philo and Josephus, their views on Pilate, is it different from the way the Gospels view Pilate?
In some ways, yeah. I mean, I think that they all have in common the fact that the Gospels also are not that interested in Pilate. They're just using him as a literary figure. And I think in the Gospels, there's definitely a sense that they want to put as much responsibility for Jesus's death onto the Jewish leaders, or in some cases, onto the Jews more broadly, and to kind of, if not exonerate Rome, at least make sure that it's clear that the Roman prefect thought that Jesus was innocent. And I think that's because writing in the late first century, there's probably been several decades of conflict between the earliest Christ followers and local synagogues or sort of, you know, Jewish people that they know. And most of the new adherents, the new converts to the faith, are coming from the Gentile world. And they want to know that, you know, the difficulty for them is that they might like Jesus's teaching, but they're a little bit nervous about the fact that he was crucified. He died as an agitator, a political criminal against Rome. And so they need some reassurance that, okay, he was crucified, but the Roman governor, you know, he was kind of pushed into it a bit by the Jewish leaders. So I think this sort of rhetorical strategy is going on in the Gospels. That's not to say that Pilate is necessarily exonerated. I think in Mark's Gospel in particular, but also in John, Pilate comes over as a pretty harsh figure. He's not a positive character. You know, he carries it. He keeps saying to the people, "Shall I release the King of the Jews?" When it's very clear that that they don't want him released. They keep pushing, and he keeps pushing and pushing. And in John's Gospel, you know, he right at the end he says, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the Jewish leaders say, "We have no king but Caesar." So in a way, he kind of, you know, he pushes and pushes and pushes the people so that they say that their allegiance is to Caesar, rather than to God, which of course was the case for all Jews in the first century. I think there's some slight differences in Luke's account. The main thing for Luke is to have Pilate as the official spokesperson for Jesus's innocence. So in Luke, Pilate 3 times says, "I find no crime against this man." So it's very clear from Luke that the Roman governor who crucified Jesus, who sent him to the cross, didn't think he was guilty. And in Luke's Gospel, he has the centurion at the end saying, "Surely this man was innocent." And he also has the story of the trial in front of Herod Antipas. That's only in Luke. And again, I think the point of that is you have 2 high status men, Antipas and Pilate, both finding Jesus innocent. So, that's quite significant. Matthew largely follows Mark in this, but he has Pilate, that the famous thing, the thing that Pilate is most famous for, washing his hands, and Pilate's wife's dream. But again, the whole point there is Pilate is washing his own hands. He's declaring his own innocence. He's not saying that Jesus is innocent. He's saying, I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with this. You can crucify him if that's what you want. So I think this is rhetorical strategy going on, trying to put the blame, the responsibility onto the Jewish chief priests or the Jewish people more broadly. But at the same time, I don't think Pilate comes over as a very positive representation of a provincial governor. He's not a very positive person.
Equal scales. Thank you for your super chat. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Is there any written record from Pilate himself on this event?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there are some early church fathers talk about the Acts of Pilate that were sent to Tiberius in Rome, and so there has been this tradition that there were reports of the trial sent to Tiberius. And if you look in sort of collections of the New Testament Apocrypha, you can find letters from Pilate to Tiberius, usually saying things like, the man came in my court today and I'm sure he was the Son of God. And then Tiberius, or sometimes Claudius, sometimes they get the emperor wrong, they write back and say, oh, tell me more. This man sounds like he was truly the Son of God. So you get this whole sort of cycle of letters from Pilate, but clearly it's later Christian piety. It's the kind of thing, that they want to escalate it up to the emperor. They want to say, oh yes, Pilate was convinced that Jesus was the Son of God, not just that Pilate thought he was innocent, but Pilate, knew in his heart. I think it's Tertullian who says that Pilate was a Christian in his heart already in the course of the trial. There is a thing called the Acts of Pilate that's part of the Gospel of Nicodemus, which probably comes from the 5th or 6th century. The Acts of Pilate themselves, we don't know how early they are, but again, probably no earlier than about the 4th century. And this is an account of Jesus's trial in front of Pilate, but it's clearly really, really legendary. So Jesus comes into the courtroom and the standards held by the Roman guards all bow down in worship of Jesus. And that the Jewish opponents get annoyed by this and they say, take him out, bring him in again. We'll see if it happens again. And so he does, and they bow down again. So, it's clearly later legendary, very pious kind of stuff, but it doesn't go back to history, unfortunately. And I think actually on a historical level, it's hard for us to realize just how little a Roman like Pilate would have thought about the life of a provincial. He's not a citizen. He's just an ordinary person from the provinces. Life was pretty easygoing. And I think there would have been maybe there would have been some sort of notch kept by a centurion, how many crucifixions each day, so that he could make sure that he had enough wood, enough crosses for the next week. But I don't think there's any chance that official records were being kept, or certainly not kept for any length of time.
So would you say that Justin Martyr, for instance, when he mentions that there's an Acts of Pilate, would you say that Justin's version of whatever he's saying or seeing as a record composed by Pilate or by somebody else, but some kind of Roman archive containing the Acts of Pilate, whatever it says, would you say that it's safe to assume that that's a separate text from the later Acts of Pilate that's contained or related and connected to the Gospel of Nicodemus?
Yeah, I think so. It might be a precursor, but I think the one that's part of the Gospel of Nicodemus doesn't seem to be that early. So, I mean, it clearly knows all of the Gospels. It sort of reads like it's got quite a long time legendary development to it. But you can imagine there may well have been sort of some kind of acts going in around in circulation from quite early on, or maybe just in just thought that there were acts, that there were likely to be acts of Pilate floating about. But no, I don't think there's any chance that there are genuine records of what transpired in Pilate's court.
Salama510, thank you for your super chat. Got Dr. Bond's book on the historical Jesus really good. Do you find where Jesus was arrested as a clue to his intentions? Mount of Olives significant to troublemakers for Rome?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because I mean, the Mount of Olives was, I mean, as with so many of these places, that's one of the troubles, isn't it? So many of these places are resonant with so much history and anticipation, expectation, the idea that the Messiah would sort of appear on the Mount of Olives. And certainly there's sort of those hints in the Gospels that when Jesus is on the Mount of Olives, he's kind of reenacting some kind of messianic thing. I don't know. I'm not sure about the arrest though, because the arrest, the idea seems to be that he's simply gone out of the city. Is he on his way back to Bethany, where he seems to be staying during Passover? Is there a particular reason for being on the Mount of Olives? I don't know, but yeah, no, it's difficult to know. And thank you for saying you like my book.
So this narrative about the much later acts of Pilate is part of a series of texts that is called the Pilate cycle. Now, given the various different church fathers and others that tell us about a Pilate cycle or some kind of Pilate correspondence
Mm.
regarding the crucifixion of Jesus, is it a possibility that maybe what, say, for instance, what Justin Martyr was talking about, could there have been maybe a Roman record that just simply talked about a record of events that happened in Pilate's reign, including the crucifixion of maybe a leader called Jesus?
I mean, it's possible. um, I suppose the thing is, you have to remember just how low literacy rates were. Who's writing this? What are they writing it for? It's it's not at all impossible that there were some very rudimentary records kept of, particularly, somebody like Jesus. He's not just any old troublemaker. He's not just somebody, you know, caught on the street and put on a cross. I mean, he clearly had made a bit of a name for himself. Pilate was likely watching him anyway before the feast. Antipas was probably already keeping spies on him. So I mean, I think he's a bigger deal than just somebody who's taken up as part of just some riot or something like that. But this, at the same time, I don't think he's such a major deal that that his that Pilate is going to feel the need to tell the legate of Syria, still less the emperor, what he's doing with him. I mean, it's possible that there were, I mean, very possible that there were accounts of Pilate's term of office, or other accounts written by Christians of Jesus's end, and some kind of a note of his trial. It was very popular in the first century to write accounts of people's death. It's called excitus literature, where you just get kind of accounts of how people died. So it's not impossible that people wrote that kind of thing about Jesus too. But again, we don't have access to any of this stuff anymore. And did they really have any particularly good historical awareness? We don't know. Was it any better than the Gospels? I doubt it.
So what do you think is most likely? Do you think that these narratives about a record regarding Pilate having Jesus crucified is could it have been based upon a real record, or was it literary fiction that was created out of the assumption that something like it must have existed?
Yeah, I think it was probably, I mean, literary fiction sort of sounds as though, I would say it's more serious than that implies. I mean, even the Acts of Pilate that now exists, embedded in the Gospel of Nicodemus, and although it's, very pious, very legendary, it serves a serious purpose. I mean, this is for Christian devotion. They are thinking about the Savior. They're thinking about um, the trial. They're thinking about the crucifixion that Jesus underwent. So I think it's serious in its way, but it's also filling in gaps. It's telling us a little bit more. It's made up, as we would say now. It's fictitious, but it's fictitious with a serious purpose, in the way maybe people might write a little piece, a little sketch, a dramatic sketch or something in a church service. You wouldn't just say, "Oh, that's literary fiction." It's nothing. It still has that kind of important purpose to it, because it's reflecting Christian devotion. But yeah, I don't think that the earliest Christians have access to any official Roman account of Jesus's trial as such. And I mean, you also need to remember that Jesus wouldn't have needed a formal trial. He's not a Roman citizen. So although Pilate is judging him according to the broad tenets of Roman law, he's judging him according to a system known as cognitio extra ordinem, where he basically holds the hearing as he wants. He presumably listens to Jesus, gives him a chance, hears the account of the chief priests, decides, is he just a lunatic? What do we do with this man? Shall we just let him go? Shall we just flog him? Shall we execute him? And of course, he does decide to send him to the cross. But I don't think he's going to keep too many accounts of all of that.
Equal scales. Thank you for your super chat. Jesus was a common name. How can we be certain that a Jesus was crucified instead of the Jesus was crucified, specifically Jesus Christ himself?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jesus was a common name, and the Gospels themselves do suggest a certain kind of ambiguity when they bring in this other character, Barabbas, who in some texts in Matthew is called Jesus Barabbas. And Barabbas itself, is very curious, because the name Barabbas means son of the Father, which is sort of very similar to Jesus Christ himself. So, yeah, I'm sure there were lots of Jesuses who were crucified, and there may well have been confusion sometimes. There may well even have been, at the trial of Jesus, some confusion, if the story of Barabbas is true, and if he was also called Jesus Barabbas, there could be some confusion there in terms of who is being crucified. Is it our Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth? Is it this other Jesus? But I don't think there's any confusion in the end that Jesus of Nazareth ends up on a cross, because the whole story of Christianity would have played out differently if that wasn't the case. And you see in the earliest sort of decades, Christians struggling to deal with this thing about the cross. How do they make sense of it? How do they deal with it? So I don't think there's any doubt that Jesus of Nazareth ended up on the cross, but certainly there could well have been other Jesuses who were also crucified.
So would you say that the way that Christians had access to records about the crucifixion of Jesus would not be the Roman archives, but instead texts and oral tradition floating around in their communities? Say, for instance, Paul probably would have heard about James, Jesus' brother, talking about Jesus, his brother, being crucified at the command of Pilate.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably, I mean, what the Gospels also give us is the impression of a confused night. So even if Jesus thought it was likely, Jesus and his followers probably thought it was likely that he might end up getting arrested. But they couldn't have known when. So he gets arrested on the Thursday night. He's taken away for some kind of interrogation by the chief priests, and then he's handed over to Pilate. So they probably didn't know exactly what was happening. They're probably running around Jerusalem trying to get friends and people they trust to tell them what's happening. Whether they have much access at all to what's going on in the sort of the high priestly circles, I would doubt. I mean, these are Galilean fishermen. They might have some connections. I mean, I know some of the Gospels suggest Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, but how much do they know what's happening? How much are we sure that these are people who are in a position to be able to tell Christians? How do we know, particularly with Joseph of Arimathea, that he even is interested in Christians? Because he might just be the guy in the council who buries people. The fact that the women don't work with him at all in the burial makes you suspect that that the idea that he's a Christian is sort of a later addition. So I think there's confusion all over. Nobody really knows what's happening. Nobody knows the exact ins and outs of any kind of trial. And Jesus wouldn't have needed any particular trial. He just maybe needed a few quick hearings, and then Pilate decided to send him to the cross. It was better all round. Get rid of him, eliminate the problem so that you don't have the worry of a riot at the feast. And then, the first thing Christians know is that he's crucified the next day. And so they're trying to find out what happened. They surmise certain things. They imagine, because the cross, the titulus on the cross says the King of the Jews, they imagine that the trial sort of revolved around whether Jesus was the King of the Jews, which is a reasonable assumption. But I don't think they've got very much hard and fast evidence. I mean, even someone like Paul, even if he's in Jerusalem, what does he know? The gospel suggests that it's a big Jewish trial of the whole council, but historians now don't think that there was a fixed council of sort of 71 people with Pharisees and Sadducees on it. The way that these things worked is just that the high priest and a couple of advisors probably just made most of the decisions. So Caiaphas has probably got a few advisors. He's got Annas, maybe other members of the family, maybe a few sort of high-ranking aristocratic Jews. But, how would someone like Paul even know what was going on? So I think, I think we need to sort of divorce our idea of justice and how these things work from what happened in the first century. It's Passover, it's volatile. Who knows what's going to happen? Jerusalem is under military control of the Romans. And if they think that a riot could in any way break out, they're just going to get rid of him pretty quickly.
Baracker, thank you for your super chat. Would Pilate have been inclined to take the body of Jesus down to be buried, or is it more likely he left the body up, like most crucified victims?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that is the normal thing. And it's part of the horrific nature of crucifixion that you don't have a proper burial. Your body is left there to rot and decay. And probably before that happens, the vultures and the dogs have done away with you. And that is part of, the whole process. But there is evidence from Judea, the Givat HaMivtah excavation, where they found a heel bone with an iron nail still in it. And the only reason that nail is there is that it got bent and they couldn't get it out again. So we know that 19-year-old man who was in that ossuary was crucified and then buried. And I mean, people sometimes say, well, that's the only evidence we've ever had of it. And that's true, but we only know about that because that nail got stuck. How would we know if there were other skeletons of people who had also been crucified? I mean, there are reasons perhaps for thinking that there may have been sometimes special considerations in Judea. The whole thing in Deuteronomy 21, 22, that says, a body hanging on a tree overnight is a curse on the land. That when they took, by the first century, they'd interpreted hanging on a tree as crucifixion. And so the idea that a dead body is still hanging up is going to be a curse on the land. And so there might have been certain accommodation to Jewish sensitivities and allowing victims to be buried. It's maybe also the fact that, it was the feast, maybe particularly at festivals. It might have been better for the Romans to some extent just to get rid of bodies quickly so that they couldn't be any kind of rallying point. So I think the fact that Paul also, in the 50s says that Jesus was buried, and he's not making any capital out of it. He just says Jesus was buried. Does incline me to think that probably he was buried. But that's not to say that he had kind of the grand burial that the Gospels suggest, this rich man's tomb, and it was a new tomb. He was the only one there. All of that, I think, is later addition to try and explain, or to try and sort of justify the fact that Christians come back to the tomb and it definitely was empty. He was the only one in it. It was this big tomb, and it was a fitting end. And John describes this huge burial fit for a king. They have all these spices that they go and bury him with. I think probably far more likely Jesus just was buried somewhere very quickly, a shallow grave. And I think Joseph of Arimathea was probably the guy from the Sanhedrin whose job it was to oversee the burial of people who were victims of state execution, and just to get them in the ground quickly. So there's no nice burial here. There's no mourning, there's no anointing, there's nothing. It's just get him down, get him in a shallow grave, and job done.
Sclatcher, thank you for your question. Is the name Pilate derived from Latin words such as pilum, spear, or pilla, pillar?
Yeah, I've always assumed it was from Pilum, and it was something to do with spear, and maybe his family were maybe they made spears, or they were good spearsmen, something like that. Yeah, we don't know. And I mean, again, Pontius, is there a link there with Pontus, the region sort of by the Black Sea? We don't know, can't tell. But yeah, I mean, it's possible that it was something to do with spear making, something like that. I just wish we knew more. What I really wish, actually, is that we knew his first name, because like all Romans of his class from the equestrian order would have 3 names. So he would be called something like Marcus Pontius Pilatus or Gaius Pontius Pilatus. And the this inscription that I mentioned that was found in Tiberias, no, not Tiberias, Caesarea, the left-hand side is missing. So the bit that it says something Pontius Pilatus, it says. So whatever his first name might have been there, but it's gone now.
So my closing question, do the church fathers over the centuries, did they have evolving and changing views on Pilate, or were their views consistent, and did it line up with the Pilate cycle as it evolved over time?
No, they didn't have. I mean, they didn't always have the same view of Pilate. And broadly speaking, there's sort of differences in the Western tradition tends to be much more negative towards Pilate. So that's where you get ideas that Pilate went and killed himself, or somehow died. There's traditions that when he died, evil spirits lurked over his body, and they had to keep interring him and pulling him up and interring him in different places. Finally, he ended up in a lake at the bottom of Mount Pilatus in Switzerland, where he still is, and the evil spirits are still there. In the Eastern Church, though, he was sort of, broadly speaking, he progressively became more and more friendly to Christianity. So that's where you have the Tertullian saying he was a Christian in his heart. He becomes I mean, that's where you have all the letters to the emperor, and he really becomes a sort of a missionary to the emperor. He's sort of confessing his belief to the emperor. And you have him. Well, his wife becomes a saint in the Coptic church and the Ethiopic church, and Pilate becomes a saint in the Ethiopic church as well. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of as good as he gets. He and his wife are seen as very positive characters, but I think that owes it's, you only if you read the Gospels in a very particular way can you see Pilate as so positive, I think.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Helen Bond.
Thank you. It's been good to talk about old Pilate.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.